Welcome to another episode of The Voice of the Church. I'm Bill Jong, a pastor at Blessings Christian Church in Hamilton, Ontario. To my right, we have as a special guest Jonathan Wellam. He's the president and CEO of Rocklinc Investment Partners. I think I got that right, in Burlington. And then to my left, I have Brian Dijkema. He's the vice president of external affairs at CARDUS, which is a faith-based think tank in the city of Hamilton. We've been talking generally about politics and economics, and then more recently about debt. And in this episode, we want to talk specifically about household and personal debt. And Jonathan, if I could begin with you, we talked last time about the escalation of global debt, but we also have a problem here in terms of household debt in Canada, which is affecting the economy at large, I would imagine. Share with us something about the problem of household debt.
Yeah, I mean, as we talked in the last episode a little bit about global debt, I mean, that's just really an amalgamation of the individual countries. And we started looking at Canada, and I mentioned briefly there that if you go back to the 70s, which were, why go back to the 70s? It was generally before a lot of the large debt increase, and things were pretty modest in terms of expectations and debt levels at that time. So people had a debt to income level of about 40%. So again, if you have a $100,000 base, the debt was about $40,000 over $100,000. Now that's an average, because you have some people who are obviously going to have a higher level of debt. They're buying a home. They're the young people. They're forging out on their life. They're newly married. They're going to typically have a bit more debt. Then you're going to have older people pay off the debt, and you're going to have people who are retired who have no debt also. So it would be average out. If you look at today's situation, Canada has one of the highest. It's right at the top. I mean, there's one or two other countries that are up there with us, Switzerland, Australia, and we're running pretty close to 180% debt to income. So that would have gone from 40,000 over that 100,000, just using a simple base, up to about 180,000 per 100,000. And that's with an aging population. That's with actually more people that should have less debt because they're older, they should have paid it off, or they're retired. So we have had this very large increase in debt levels. Some of that clearly tied to the increasing prices of homes, so that mortgages are getting larger and larger, and people have had to go further into debt. But there's also a comfort level with debt. People just don't mind spending money that they don't have for things they probably don't need in many cases. There's also that issue of just acquiring materialism and so on. So there's a number of factors that are feeding. It's not just one thing, but at the end of the day, we've got way too much debt based upon our income levels to service it, and that's putting stress on people, on families, on our country, and will have longer term implications.
Brian, I wonder if you could share with us something about the history of debt as well. I would think that the credit card would be a major player in the escalation of debt, but share with us a little bit about what you know about the history of household debt, personal debt.
Yeah, so we did a bit of work on a particular type of debt, which was payday loan debt, and we'll maybe talk about that a little bit later. But as we were going through it, we sort of said, where did this come from? What is the view? How have the views of debt changed? We can go way back to the medieval period and say, point out the fact that lending was actually illegal. Lending for interest was actually illegal in many cases. Well, that's certainly not true today. If you look at, especially in recent years, as sort of Jonathan was alluding to, the last number of decades, you saw a tremendous change in the comfort, and I think you're right to getting at that sort of cultural side of things. And you could see it actually change with certain bits of technology as well. So the debit card was introduced. I don't know if you remember in the 90s, it was the debit card. You used to have to go in and you have to fill out the bank slips. Kids won't understand at all what I'm talking about, but I'm sort of on this sort of straddling the old and the new. But you used to have to go in and fill out stuff to get get cash from the bank. The introduction of the debit card itself, the fact that you could even access your bank account, real assets, with a card, with a piece of plastic, almost like magic, you could see the debt increase with the introduction of the debit card. And then you saw the sort of mass proliferation of credit cards. So they used to be that credit cards were, you had to have a pretty good credit score to be able to qualify for one. In the late, sort of the mid-90s, the late 90s, they started to proliferate, started giving them out almost like candy. And there is an addictive nature of it to some extent. When you saw that happen, debt went up even more. And of course, during this whole time, hearkening back to the earlier conversation, interest rates went lower and lower and lower. So the cost of bearing that debt seemed to be less and less and less, and it wasn't an objective fact, but what people did was not borrow and then pay it down. They just took on a lot more, to the point where now, because money's so cheap, people are spending a ton of it and just building up debt. And the critical point is that it's not debt necessarily for appreciable assets. So things like houses that are going to appreciate, or you're going to invest in a business and you're taking out, it's liquid debt. It's debt for things like clothing, cars, furniture, trips to the Bahamas, right, or Cuba or wherever. People are borrowing for that type of thing. And I think Jonathan's right, and hopefully we can chat about it. There's been a cultural shift in our approach to debt. It used to be that you almost were embarrassed if you had to, if you had to take on a certain amount of debt, right? These days it's normal. It's very normal. And I think that's been accompanied by the sort of rise of what certain think tanks in the States and in Canada would call anti-thrift institutions. And I would mean that the banks themselves have become anti-thrift to some extent. They're always seeking out, I get all the time, your line of credit, you can increase it by $25,000. You get one of those almost every month. And I think there's sort of been a shift away from the thrifty, and I don't mean cheap, I'm a Dutchman, so we can talk about that, but a shift away from this notion that you should be frugal to this notion of, well, you know what, spend now and someone will deal with it
Sometimes
later.
it's a little more complicated, though. I've got a story. I had a parishioner in a previous church who bought a brand new computer back when brand new computers were $3,500. I don't know if you remember that. And he bought it on credit. And I said to him, why didn't you just buy a used computer, good used computer with cash, like for $1,000? He said, I didn't have the cash. So isn't that deeply ironic that this gentleman who was cash poor could buy something that he simply couldn't afford, but on credit? And I'm sure there's a mentality there that's very common in our society today.
Well, I mean, as Brian pointed out, there's no question that the financial institutions, your liability is their asset, and they're in the business of growing. And if they're going to continue to grow, TD Bank, RBC, all the big boys, they have to get you to take on more liability, more debt. And so they're very creative at it. And so they're coming at you from every side and every angle, not just the homes anymore. How do we provide financing for cars? I mean, going back 30 years ago, very few people would lease. Very few people, if they did borrow, they'd pay their car off very quickly, or they would save up the money and then buy it with cash. I mean, I just remember even I'm dating myself, but you go back into the 70s, very few people were borrowing for very long periods for cars. Now it's normal. In fact, people, there's reoccurring, they'll just go from one lease to the next. In fact, in some cases, financial institutions will give you 120% of the value of of the car you're going to buy to make it easier for you to get out of your previous loan to roll it into a new one. And so there's all sorts of creative things that have come in order to keep this growing and keep people borrowing and keep people, feeding the animal, if you will. And that is just all the wrong incentives, and people have become used to it. They think it's normal. They haven't lived through a financial crisis. I mean, we saw a little bit in 2008 and so forth, but and when I was young, my parents would still talk about the Depression years and the terrible times and the difficulties, and always keep liquidity. We've gone through a pretty decent period of time, and people are just comfortable with the debt, and they think it's normal, and the institutions are very creative at
I wonder what you would recommend, Brian, to a young person. So my son recently needed a student loan and had a hard time getting one because he had no credit rating, because he had no credit card. So that seemed kind of odd to me, that you needed a credit card in order to establish a credit rating, because we've, as a family, have talked quite negatively about credit cards. But what do you advise for a young person in terms of financial stewardship, the use of credit cards?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, there's sort of I'll take it on two angles, the sort of general one, and then I'll get at that student loan and the credit score question because I think they're sort of two separate ones. The first thing to do is to look at the way your grandma did her budget. So I know that this is, young people shouldn't be saying this, but your grandma knew how to budget better than you did. That would be the first thing. And why did she do that? She used cash. And I don't mean to say that everyone needs to take out wads of cash, but studies have shown, lots and lots of studies have shown, that if you're actually seeing the money disappear, you are way better at meeting your budget than if you're using a card, plastic. So this gets back to the earlier thing I was saying, where you actually don't know until the end of the month or whenever you check. So if you really want to be stewardly and you want to actually build up savings, use cash. Because you will see handing over a $20 bill or a $50 bill actually is psychologically painful. Whereas swiping a card is it's like magic. And so, my wife and I are deeply invested in this group called Christians Against Poverty. I think Jonathan's done some work with them, and you know them. Our church runs one out of there. When CAP is Christians Against Poverty, they work with people in debt. And they do a tremendous job of helping people get out of that slavery. But the very first thing they do is a two-step process. Step one, know what you're going to spend, what you need for the month. So build a budget. That's sort of basic 101. But the second thing, and I think this is the secret sauce, is they say, use cash. Because when you start to see that go away, you suddenly say, oh, this is all I've got left. I can't spend more than I have. So that would be.
I think that works in another way as well. If your budget for groceries in a week is $200, and you go to the grocery store with $200 and not your card, you're going to carefully do the calculations to make sure that you don't exceed the 200 because you only have 200. But if you're just doing the calculations in your head, it's probably going to amount to 225 or something like that. And so I can see the importance of cash in that respect.
That's right, and it's actually, people. There's a wonderful journalist for the Washington Post named Megan McArdle. She tried out all these things. She says, look, the best one, I came out with the most money and knew exactly what was going on. I had the least stress when I did what my grandma did. I took out cash and put it in envelopes. But can
I want to ask you, Brian, what you would say to a young man or young woman growing up in this world? I imagine you might say it's a good time to invest, but what kind of advice would you give to help people avoid the trap of building unnecessary debt?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, I'm in the financial business, so I do, have younger clients, and so there's a number of things that you're going to do. One of the things, financial literacy too. I mean, there's a certain amount of knowledge that people have to know about compounding and how money works. And again, to go back to the system that we have now, our educational system, I think, falls far, far short, and families too. Parents should be teaching their children disciplines and how to manage money and budgets and so forth. So again, a lot of it financial literacy, so they understand how it works, because if you can delay gratification, if you will, you'll actually end up with more. That's the irony of it all. And we know that as Christians, again, delayed gratification is powerful, and being careful and expressing yourself when you should and so forth. So what I would tell a couple is, look, a budget, number one. The first thing they should start saving for, I mean, in the Canadian context, they use the TFSA and savings account, and start saving for a deposit for a home. I think it's important. I encourage people to look for the opportunity to buy a home and to start setting aside some money that way. And then it becomes an issue of buying something that you have some margin of safety on, that you can afford. It's not going to put too much stress on your finances, stress on the home, get into marital problems and marital issues. You can handle it. Start off with a starter home, start to build equity. So it's all about, again, sticking to a budget, being reasonable, building in some margin of safety, if you will, in terms of what you're doing, and take a longer-term view. And don't, start budgeting now so you're not wasting money. Put it towards a house, put it towards hard assets, and start saving. So, it's really, there's no silver bullet. It's really blocking and tackling, and taking a longer-term disciplined view. And, with these interest rates so low, take advantage of that opportunity to save money, and then, when you do have a mortgage, pay it down, start to build equity faster. And that's critical. Don't just use the low interest rates to go and spend more money, and that's what the banks will want you to do. So basic things like that.
Well, that leads to another question. Lending institutions, they're all eager to have you sign on the dotted line, and we go to the bank and they make us feel so good, right? Like they're doing us a big favor.
You're richer than you think.
Exactly, they're helping us out. But Are there some institutions that would be better than others in terms of borrowing money, or are they all basically the same? Is a credit union, for example, share with us something about credit unions, which historically have offered lower rates than some of the more established banks?
Yeah, so I think that the best way to think about the various institutions is to talk about it as a spectrum, right? So on the one hand, you have the best bank, which is what I like to call the bank of mom and dad. Right, which is not that bank for my parents is not accessible to me, but for a lot of people, and what I mean that's just shorthand for somebody that you have a relationship with. High relational capital actually means that costs are often lower. You're not paying for insurance, you're not paying for, and the collateral is really trust, right? So you have that in churches, you have that with a variety of ethnic associations do that. A variety of different groups do that type of thing where collateral is trust. In fact, that's a huge thing in development these days. You have these saving circles where people will pool their money together. One of the persons in the circle will use it, and the reason why it works is because they all know where each other lives. They all know they're holding each other accountable, they're seeing each other. That's the best type of borrowing institution or arrangement, okay? So that there's a high level of trust and the collateral is social. Now, not all of us have enough capital laying around to buy houses, that are costly, or to buy investments of that sort. So you're then looking for what is the type of institution that most closely resembles that type of close relational, and that I would say in this case, in many cases, it's a credit union type of thing. One example is there's this beautiful example of the Christian social tradition at work in Canada, is that. In early Canadian history, in the late 1800s, a lot of administrative staff working for Parliament needed loans because they weren't being paid very well. They needed loans, and they had to go to loan sharks, which is the opposite side of that, right? Where the collateral is violence, right? If I don't get the money back, it's your kneecaps that are the collateral, right? That's the opposite end of that spectrum. So this Catholic fellow, his name was Alphonse Desjardins. And that will probably ring a bell for a lot of people who've seen the Desjardins Credit Union. He started because of his beliefs in what the Christian tradition taught about lending and borrowing. And he started a credit union, which is effectively a pooled savings bank that started with very little. There's a number of other ones, and if you hear the stories, it's often for people who didn't have access to credit, but who had a community. And that community pooled their assets together and were able to grow that wealth over time, so that you see places like Dijkema or Desjardins now having billions of dollars of assets built on those community fronts. So, and you've got that. So bank of mom and dad, you've got the credit unions, you've got the banks, which are, banks don't really, I would say, they don't really care about you. You're a number to them. And they're very useful. I'm not saying that you don't ever bank with some of the big banks, but they're not social in that sense.
Didn't you have an interesting factoid for me about what credit unions were first called?
Yeah, they were. In fact, way back in the day, in the medieval period, they were called mounts of piety. So for people, in that sense, it was a place where you could go. The pious people would pool their money together to help those in need who didn't have access to credit. And I think it's actually a beautiful picture. There's a sense in which it's not socialist, right? It's a sense, but it is social. It's not taking the state, it's a group of people cooperating together to pool their assets, and that's the ideal for the market, right? That there's a sense in which you're pooling your assets. The big banks and stock holding companies are sort of versions of that, and I'm not, but there's certain beauty to that type of approach.
I wanted to ask you a question, Jonathan. You have a lot of young people, maybe newlyweds, who have a lot of debt, house debt, maybe car debt, maybe school debt, and they're not in a position to give to the church, or at least they say they're not in a position. What do you recommend there? So think in terms of an individual or a couple that has a lot of debt, the responsibility of giving to the Lord, but maybe also tack onto that investing. Does it make any sense to begin to invest before you've paid down your debt? Or is that something that just waits until after the debt has been paid off? I imagine there's a slightly different answer to each question, but...
Yeah. Well, in the first issue, in terms of giving back to the Lord, I mean, that's a command, that's a responsibility we have as Christians. And so I think that has to become an automatic slice in the budget right away, as fast as possible. It's going to be a smaller slice, and they're going to have to, and you want them to pray and to work as hard as possible so that can grow up to be a responsible piece of the pie as quickly as possible. And that should be number one priority as Christians, to be able to support the church and to support the kingdom work. And so that's a high priority. I don't think it's good to be going into debt if you're supporting the church, but they need to get their house in order as quickly as possible. So, again, priorities there. The second issue is that I do think that the first focus should be on debt, paying down the debt before you're making a lot of investments. You can start to make investments even though you have debt when you have discretionary money and when you're taking care of the Lord's work and charitable giving, and when the debt is now manageable and you can pay all the interest and also do some principal reduction at the same time, then you can slide over and start to make some investments. So you can do the two at the same time. So I wouldn't say pay down all your debt, but again, you want to have the debt reasonable, handable. You can take care of it. It's comfortable. It's not putting the stress on the situation. You can give to the church and take care of the family, and then start to make investments as soon as possible. Because again, everyone knows the rule of compounding. The longer you can have your money invested, the more impact it's going to have. So if you can have 30 years of compounding, it's going to have a profound effect upon the value versus 5 years or 10 years. So yeah, so balance. But I think the church is absolutely number one priority, but get your house in order, cut down the debt, and once you're manageable, then start to make broader investments and be disciplined in how you're, again, running your budget. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's wise.
What about the situation that we face locally of inflated housing costs and how difficult it is for young people to get into the housing market? What encouragement can you give to young people today to enter that market? And is there a role that the church plays in any of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing, I ask a couple of questions. First of all, is why do you need to own a house? You don't necessarily need to own a house. It may be more responsible for you to rent if rent is reasonable, to rent and invest your money elsewhere. I'm saying that you have to make certain judgment calls in that way. And it may be the point where the housing market is outstripping the cost of rent, and it may make more sense to do that. So that just, you don't need to own a house to be a good human being or a good citizen.
That's a great point. Yeah.
The other thing I would say is, let's also take a bit of an example of how we talked a little bit about that sort of self-individual, atomistic understanding of society. That plays itself out in financial markets, but it also plays itself out in architecture and in neighborhood planning. So we have to ask ourselves, why is it that we need a 30,000, or I'm just picking a number out of the head, square foot house for one family, for a couple that doesn't have any kids or that's going to have 2 or 3 kids? It may be that our architecture is also reflecting, our city planning is also reflecting an atomistic understanding of the family and the household that's not in line with Christianity. And so you may ask yourselves, what would it look like to embody that body of Christ, the family of Christ, in new ways? And you see more and more people doing that. We were talking a little bit earlier about couples will say to one another, look, and we have actually a number of people in our church who have done this, a family of 5 and a family, 2 families of 5, and they said, look, let's buy a house together. Let's pool our assets. Again, this comes down to the cooperative nation. Let's pool our assets. We'll buy a house together. We don't each need a 25,000 square foot or whatever the size is house. We'll get a bigger house than normal, and we'll split it up in such a way that it can work. And I think there are a lot of there are challenges with that. We have to adjust our the way we relate to one another. But there can be families of nuclear families that are sort of expanding a little bit beyond, able to bring people into them and to pool those assets to live as a community. You can do that in ways that are not going to harm your sort of privacy matters and all that type of stuff. But that's another possibility, and I think there's one where with potential for enhancing. We talked about expanding that community of love. There's ways in which that can be done well. Yeah.
Right. Jonathan, I want to ask you a question about a biblical text, and I can't cite the reference, but in the Mosaic Law, Israel is forbidden to lend at interest. Is the Bible there prohibiting any kind of loan with interest? Would it be a violation of the law of God for a Christian business person to offer a loan at interest? What's behind that command so far as you understand?
Okay, so the Old Testament law. Yeah, I mean, I think that applied to the Israel and to the within the Israeli nation, within the nation of Israel. I don't think that that applies in terms of us today, in terms of interest. And I would agree with Calvin's view on that, and the Reformation, where they actually said that interest was just fine. The issue will be a proper amount of interest and a market rate of interest that's reasonable and not usury and abusing the situation, abusing a power relationship to extract a high rate of interest, which would be way over what would be, just and reasonable and so forth. And that's where, I think the markets come in and you want to be competitive. But no, I think that charging interest is fine. I don't think there's a biblical prohibition against that at all.
It probably really depends on the situation. Is it a poor brother in the church that needs some help, or is it somebody who's going to use the money to invest himself in a business? Or I can imagine a lot of different scenarios.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. All of those issues are going to have an impact on the interest rate and whether you're going to charge interest. I mean, we have clients, and they'll often have money. They'll be helping out other family members and things like that, and often I'll tell them, as best as possible, don't start attaching interest. And if you can forgive it, or if it's just to help them out, it's much better to do that than to get tied into all sorts of, financial obligations. So be very careful about that in terms of how you help people. But no, I think the whole issue of interest is the price of money. So it puts a responsibility in how you use money. It puts a price on it, which I think is important in the economic situation, because people don't abuse money then. If it's free, then there's going to be abuse of it if there isn't interest. So I think it's responsible. The issue is it can also be abused. Right. And that's when I think the interest rate has to be reasonable. It has to be one that's not gouging, and one that is repayable and manageable. And we should never put people in positions knowingly and with intent to strap them to the debt and become servants to the debt. And that's what we see often taking place. And that is wrong, and the church should be adamant against that. And
you're an economist, Brian. What's a biblical interest rate?
A little less than I'm paying right now. Just joking. That's just, again, I go back. It's you can't use the Bible and say that 2% is just and 1% is unjust or 5% is unjust. I mean, what Jonathan was alluding to, and he's right to say it, is that Scripture has very harsh words for those who are lending at interest in situations where they're taking advantage of the other partner's weakness, right? And so if you look in Ezekiel, Ezekiel calls it an abomination, right? Condemning it to hell, and using strong language, the strongest possible language, an abomination. Jesus, when he was flipping over the table of the money changers, if the money changers were not giving a fair exchange rate, they were extorting people who were taking Roman coinage and getting the temple coinage, which was the only ones that could be used and they were extorting them. And many people were taking advantage of it. People like Mary and Joseph, who could only afford a couple of turtle doves, right? And so what Scripture is talking about in those situations is when there's an unequal relationship between parties, and the one is lording it over the other to keep them in a type of slavery, in a type of bondage. And I think that's the moral crux of the issue. So, I can't put a number onto that, but there is a number in a given situation where somebody charging, 5%, for some person that may be too much. And I think that comes back again to how do we understand the relationship of borrowing and lending? And the best one, again, as Jonathan was sort of alluding to, is where that relational capital is extremely high. And you talked about you don't lend to your family at a 12% rate, because that would just be, that would be doing something wrong. Mm-hmm. And so I think if you look at Scripture, and I wish we'd look at it a little more sometimes, the number of times that charging rates at interest for the poor, the person who's indebted, Jesus uses that as example of this debtor, that debtor, right? There's this notion that if you are using your strength and your financial position to extort or squeeze a little bit of life, a little bit more life for your own ends, that's not a just transaction. Yeah, I don't know. I think that sort of gets at what
No, it's exactly. I think that look, putting a reasonable price on money makes it accountable, and we should be using the money with our talents. We should be creating value. That's why Jesus, in the parable of the talents, he said, well, to the wicked servant that had the one, well, why didn't you give it to the bankers for interest, right? So we have to use our money wisely, and the interest just puts a proper price on it. But again, a proper price, not one that's going to extort. And as Brian has rightly said, if there's a unequal relationship, power relationship, you get into all sorts of issues. We should not be abusing it. And so those are the caveats. Those are the things that are important. But it is important that our use of money, along with ourselves as human beings made in the image of God, we are to be using it wisely and creating more value. That's part of the stewardship of the world that we have been given to in terms of a mandate. Or my money isn't just to sit idle.
That's great.
And so that's all part of it. But again, proper balance, proper perspective, covered with love and with ethics and morality around it.
Let's conclude this segment with a way to redress this problem. So you shared before you didn't think this was an area where the government should get involved regulating how much a credit card can charge in terms of interest or something like that. But we do want the culture to change. I don't think it's going to happen by getting the right political party in power, in Canada at least. Share with us a little bit about how you think we can influence the Canadian culture on this issue of escalating household debt, and then I'll have you speak to that as well to conclude, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the government should not be involved in overseeing, interest rate levels.
There is actually a law, a usury law,
Yeah.
that says 60% is the max you can charge.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is part of the legal framework that a government should operate in terms of the laws and justice and so forth. And I'm not saying exactly where the rate should be, but I think the government should be concerned about that because unequal power relationships can develop, and they're hard to redress at a competitive level sometimes. And there's inefficiencies that can take place. So I wouldn't suggest that the government shouldn't be looking at that. But in terms of going forward, in terms of the indebtedness, just back to your question, just trying to, what was the key?
What can we do to change the culture? What can we do to reverse things in Canada?
Well, I mean, from I guess from my perspective, I think it goes back to a spiritual issue. I think in terms of changing that, I think show people that look, materialism is not the answer. That life is not based upon things; it's based upon relationships. Most importantly, with God, and your relationships then with each other in society or families. And again, delayed gratification and being careful about just becoming part, keeping up with the Joneses and getting into the rat race is not productive at all. In fact, it's very counterproductive, and it's creating huge stress and huge problems in the broader economy. So I think it's getting back to basics: why we're here, what's important, what should we value, what do we value the highest, and that will then shape our budgets and our spending, and then stick to budgets. And life will be much more pleasant, and you'll have much less stress. Remember, I was at one of the annual meetings in Omaha, Nebraska, years ago, and Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, the two big investors, they were there, and someone asked a question. They go, "How do I reduce, my stress? And I'm concerned about my finances and things like that." And Charlie Munger sat there and he goes, "Spend less, spend less than you earn." That was the end of the question. So, I mean, there's a lot of simplicity, and be careful, don't overspend, but have the right priorities. If we're going to change the culture, they're going to have to reshape their priorities and what life's all about and why they're here and what's important in the first place. And certainly not just the pursuit of things. That is not going to give them the satisfaction they want. They need ultimately to be pursuing God.
Brian.
A couple. I'll end with what I hope is a practical note for people. I think there's you alluded to it earlier about the minimalism trend and the Marie Kondo. She's got the show on Netflix and all that stuff. I think that's a good trend, and I think it's a good trend. And I wouldn't agree with the sort of the end of it right now. What brings you joy? I don't think that's. I mean, that's great to minimalize so it brings you joy and satisfaction. You're left with that. But the trend of saying, what is it that I actually need to thrive as a creature of God? And do I need more? So ask yourself, don't go Marie Kondo for your own self, but to look at it and say, go through your closet and say, do I need 8 suits? Right, I'm just taking an example of, maybe you don't need 8 suits, maybe you need 3. And not because it's going to bring you joy or the other ones aren't going to bring it. Just say, look, I don't need that, right? Or when you're thinking about buying that other thing, wait a week, right? If you're going to buy something, wait a week, wait 2. Do you still need it, right? These are very practical hints in which what to do. Another one that I think doesn't get enough play, particularly in our Protestant churches, is fasting. So it says to yourself, what fasting is an attempt, it's a spiritual discipline given to us by God, right? So Jesus doesn't command fasting, but he certainly expects it. So he says, when they're talking with the disciples, it says, they shouldn't be fasting when the bridegroom is here, right? Remember that bit on the Sabbath? But he says, there will be a time when the bridegroom is taken that they should fast, and they will fast. And I think that for Christians, the spiritual discipline of fasting, of giving up voluntarily the things that feed our stomachs, the food, the drink, the clothes, the type of things that feed our stomachs, our appetites, giving those things up voluntarily so that you can begin to focus on the thing that matters most, on God, on prayer. You'll suddenly find that spiritual practice of fasting, you will find over time as you do it that you'll look upon things and you say, I don't really care about that. And what ends up happening, and again, this is the beautiful thing about the sort of Christian tradition of thrift. It doesn't mean you have less. You'll end up with more. That more can be either invested in socially useful goods and services, businesses, right, that are actually help you respond to that first Great Commission, or you'll have more to give to the church and the poor, right? You'll have more to give of yourself. It doesn't mean you become poorer, but it does focus you. It focuses your money on that which matters most.
And I think in the discipline of fasting, you discover, even when you're hungry, that in another sense you're full. And I love the line from Augustine, God created us for himself. Our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. And there's something very insatiable about greed and about all the idols of the world. And we experience our greatest contentment in the Lord Jesus Christ. I want to thank you, gentlemen, Jonathan.
That reminds you of that verse, seek ye first the kingdom of God and all his righteousness, and all this other things will be added to you. So again, it's the priority. That tends to marinate all of our other decisions.
Absolutely. What a wonderful text. Thank you, Jonathan and Brian, for participating in this discussion, and thank you for tuning in.